polemics and arguments with what they consider these stubborn, pig-headed people, that they go beyond all bounds and miss the benefit of what these people are saying. We, I think, are ready for the pendulum to swing around a bit. We're interested in pure foods. I don't know anyone who's in the modern generation who's not into pure foods. And most of the young women I meet through my family are vegetarians. I don't know. There's so much vegetarianism among young women. It's it's hard for me to count how many there are out there. There's so many. So pure foods are in. James could be a big hero to the present generation. All we got to do is market him a bit. We might be able to get somewhere on this stuff. Anyway, so chapter 10. So we know that Peter was a swing figure in Galatians. But when the representative of James came down, he stopped doing table fellowship because of the purity regulations. And then he calls those people of the circumcision. So it looks like they either insisted on circumcision or were part of the group of the circumcision. Whatever it is, circumcision was also a part of their thing. And since that's true, Paul spends the rest of Galatians from chapter 2 to 6 going absolutely insane over circumcision. I mean, like, the guy is totally, he's lost it. And you can consider him a saint. But when I read him, he sounds like he's out of his mind. But he's quite a clever fellow, and he's very good at argument and polemics, and he's extremely good at rhetoric. So the arguments or the positions that he sets forth are very, I wouldn't say convincing, they're very impressive in terms of the agility, the rhetorical agility that he displays. He's a rhetorician, and where did he get these schools? He could only, to my mind, have gotten them in Greek rhetorical schools. The thing that Plato and Socrates are calling sophistry. How many of you have studied Greek philosophy? The classical Greek philosophers hate the sophists, don't they? They consider this superficial rhetorical skills. And that's what's being taught in a lot of these academies. And that's 4 or 5 centuries old, and people like Cicero and everyone else are really big on their rhetorical skills. Things that we've forgotten today. Lawyers study it again. So I think that's where Paul's big advantage is. He's a tremendous rhetorician. If you compare him with the letter of James, you're talking to about a professional opposed to a rank amateur. One who's highly educated, at least in those areas. And a Herodian aristocrat would have been. A Herodian aristocrat would have been well educated in those areas. A Palestinian peasant wouldn't have been. So, and certainly Paul was no mere tent maker, as some like to portray him as. He was highly schooled in Greek rhetoric. Okay, so in any case, we get a presentation where Peter is now told that he shouldn't make problems over these issues. But you see, the Peter in Galatians is not clear about this. When the chips are down, he goes to the James side, so he's under James's control. And Barnabas goes with him, as we read last time. And what does Paul call Barnabas? Oh, I didn't hand out a roll sheet. You guys are all doing this. I suppose I should hand out a roll sheet, if I can find one here. I see you're all visually. Put the date on top, would you please? I appreciate it. If you're reading Galatians, and at least read 1 and 2, if not all of it. Paul, at one point, then, is so angry at Barnabas, and sometimes he calls Peter Peter, sometimes he calls him Cephas, and that's confusing people. In any case, he's so angry at them, he says, and that they were hypocrites. And he calls them hypocrites. And I told you, and I'll tell it to you again, a long time later, Augustine writes Jerome. Augustine is living in the 400s. Jerome is the late 300s, early 400s. Jerome has gone to Palestine. He's living in Bethlehem. He's collecting what later becomes the Vulgate Latin Bible. He's obviously, by the way, seen Dead Sea Scroll materials, it looks like, as well at that time. Some were coming in at that time. Anyway, Augustine takes a long time for correspondence to come from North Africa to Palestine, but he writes him and says, look, I'm reading this Galatians, and I see that Paul has the temerity to call our holy Peter a hypocrite. What am I to make of this? I mean, how can he dare do this? And Jerome takes around 3 years to reply to him, and he basically says, so you see, people were aware of these problems back then. Some things are best left not to look too deeply into, or something to that effect. Basically, he says, fobs it off and says, Jerome is really the voice of the high church as we know it. You know, he solves a lot of the problems for the church as it is developing in the next century after Eusebius. And he says, look, Augustine, calm down. You know, some things are best left not investigated. You know, Galatians is best left not investigated. But if you look at it, so we know from that that the issue is not resolved. Pure foods issue, table fellowship issue, bodily purity matters are not been resolved in Jesus' lifetime. And the James party, clearly the Jerusalem leadership has a different position than the Paul Gentile mission group. And that's obvious why the Gentile mission group can't be insisting on people to do all these things. It's going to make any important headway, is it? But the Jerusalem leadership is not interested in this kind of headway. The Jerusalem leadership is much more parochial and is more interested in the purity of the regulations. And I think it's more like a Essene, Dead Sea Scroll mindset. That's how I would put it. And so when the chips are down, Barnabas and Paul goes over to James' side. And I don't think, and they refuse anymore to have company with Paul in the Galatians. They basically shun him, and I think that continues. And now in Acts we get Paul and Barnabas breaking also, but they break over John Mark, wherever he is, who will appear momentarily. And Paul at one point says in chapter 15, when they're going to go on another missionary journey, Barnabas wants to bring John Mark along, and Paul says, I will not travel with that man who deserted our work in Pamphylia. And if you look earlier around chapter 13 in Acts, you'll see that John Mark left Paul for unspecified reasons and went back to Jerusalem clearly to report on what he was doing. Now, I don't know who John Mark is supposed to be, whether there actually was a John Mark, whether this is a write-over for another name or not. But I think that that's Acts' way of saying Barnabas and Paul don't travel with each other. And Paul starts traveling with young Greco-Jews, Titus, Timothy, Silas, people like that, in the latter part of Acts, who are different. Luke, who writes, or is supposed to write Acts. And I think Titus and Timothy aren't easily distinguished from each other. Timothy would be the Greek, Titus would be the Latin, and I'm not sure these are two different people. Sometimes they look like they are, but I think that they probably are just. Anyway, he says at one point he has Timothy circumcised after Acts 15, even though I think his mother was a Jewess and his father was not. He was a mixed parentage, something like Paul himself, I think, is mixed background.